The salty breeze drifted through the corridors of Azure Pearl Resort, carrying the distant hum of waves crashing against the shore. Sienna Brooks let out a weary sigh as she stepped out of the kitchen, rubbing her aching wrists. Another long shift, 14 hours of chopping, kneading, plating, and scrubbing. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. The last of the guests had retired to their luxurious suites, and most of the staff had already gone home. She should be heading back too. Her tiny rented studio was barely 10 minutes away, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her limbs. Just 5 minutes, she muttered to herself, stepping into an empty VIP suite. The room was pristine, the scent of fresh linen and ocean air mingling in a way that felt almost comforting. A grand 4-poster bed dominated the space, but Sienna ignored it, choosing instead to sink into the plush lounge chair by the window. The view overlooked the moonlit waves, stretching infinitely into the horizon. 5 minutes, she promised herself again, closing her eyes. She never heard the door open. The soft click of Italian leather shoes against the marble floor jolted Sienna from her unintended slumber. Her eyes snapped open, locking onto the figure standing near the entrance. A tall, broad-shouldered man, silhouetted against the dim glow of the hallway. Alexander Carter. The name alone made her stomach drop. He was the Alexander Carter, the man who owned this entire resort chain, known for his cold efficiency and razor-sharp business acumen. And she was currently trespassing in his suite. Sienna shot up from the chair, heart pounding. I'm so sorry, she stammered. I didn't mean to. Alexander remained silent, his gaze unreadable as he studied her. Sharp blue eyes, the kind that missed nothing, the kind that had made him a legend in the hospitality industry. Finally he spoke, his voice smooth yet edged with quiet amusement. I don't recall allowing my staff to use VIP suites as break rooms. Sienna stood frozen, her breath unsteady. She knew she should say something, anything that might explain her situation better, but under Alexander's sharp gaze, every word caught in her throat. He didn't seem angry. If he were, she'd probably be escorted out by security already. But instead of kicking her out, Alexander stepped further into the room, shrugging off his jacket and draping it over a chair, as if her presence didn't bother him at all. You work here? He asked, his voice calm and measured. Sienna swallowed hard and nodded. I'm in the kitchen. Today was exhausting, and I didn't think I'd actually fall asleep here. Alexander nodded, considering something. He poured himself a glass of whiskey from the bar, swirling the amber liquid before looking at her again. How long do you plan on standing there? Sienna blinked. I'm sorry, what? Sit. He gestured toward the chair across from him. I want to hear about your work. She hesitated, wondering if this was some kind of trap. But something told her that Alexander Carter wasn't the type to play games. He was far too direct, too controlled for that. After a moment of uncertainty, she sat down. Does your head chef know you take naps in guest suites? Alexander took a sip of his drink, his tone carrying the faintest hint of amusement. Sienna flushed. Of course not. If they knew, I'd probably be fired. He tilted his head slightly. And yet you still did it? She chuckled lightly, shrugging. I've been on my feet for 14 hours. I just needed 5 minutes to rest. But I guess I miscalculated. Alexander was quiet for a moment before he suddenly asked, why did you choose to become a chef? The question caught Sienna off guard. She thought of her mother's tiny kitchen, the smell of fresh pastries filling the air, the warmth of Sunday mornings spent baking together, of her dream to one day own her own bakery, where people could find comfort in the simplest of things. Because I love it, she said simply. I love how food can bring back memories, how it can turn a bad day into a bearable one, or make an ordinary moment feel special. Alexander didn't respond right away, but something shifted in his expression. Curiosity, maybe even the slightest hint of intrigue. After a moment, he placed his glass down, crossing his arms. Tomorrow, 3 p.m., I want you to make me a dessert. Sienna's eyes widened. What? A dessert that will make me remember you. She opened her mouth to refuse, but the way Alexander watched her, calculating, expectant, made her pause. This is an opportunity, Sienna. Don't turn it down too quickly. By 3 p.m. the next day, Sienna stood in the kitchen of Azure Pearl Resort, her heart pounding against her ribs. She wasn't sure why she had agreed to Alexander Carter's bizarre request. Part of her had wanted to refuse. She owed nothing to a billionaire who happened to find her napping in his suite. But another part was curious. She wanted to know what he really thought. Taking a steadying breath, she got to work. She chose to make a lemon tart, a dessert tied to the warmest memories of her childhood. Whenever her mother had a rough day, she would bake one, saying, "A little tartness reminds you that life isn't always sweet, but when balanced right, even the sour moments become unforgettable." Sienna carefully baked the crust to a golden crisp, whisked the lemon curd to velvety perfection, and sprinkled delicate shavings of zest over the top. When it was done, she placed it on a plate, nerves still buzzing under her skin. Alexander arrived right on time. He walked into the kitchen like he didn't belong there, his expensive suit, his imposing presence, but he commanded the space effortlessly. The entire staff stilled, their conversations hushed as they stole glances at their formidable boss. Sienna exhaled and pushed the plate toward him. "This is my choice," she said, keeping her voice steady. Alexander stared at the dessert for a moment before picking up a fork, slicing off a small bite and tasting it. Silence. Sienna held her breath, waiting, but Alexander didn't react immediately. He just looked at her, slow, intent, as if he was evaluating more than just the dessert. After a moment, he set the fork down. "Why a lemon tart?" he asked. Sienna blinked, caught off guard. "Because it reminds me of my mother," she admitted. "She used to say that life is like a lemon tart, sometimes bitter, but if you know how to balance it, it becomes something worth remembering." Alexander said nothing for a long moment. Then, suddenly, he leaned against the counter, arms crossing over his chest. "I have a new restaurant opening in Miami," he said, "and I need a head pastry chef." Sienna's eyes widened, certain she had misheard him. "Excuse me?" Sienna felt like the ground beneath her had shifted. A week ago, she was just a trainee. Now, a billionaire was offering her a role she had only dreamed of. Her mind raced through doubts. Was she good enough? Could she handle the pressure? Or was this just another test she was bound to fail? "I'm offering you a job," he clarified. "Not as a trainee, but as the head of the pastry department." The word stunned her. "But I'm just a trainee. I've never run a kitchen before." "You have talent," Alexander said simply. "More importantly, you have passion. I don't need someone who just follows recipes. I need someone who understands the meaning behind what they create." She stared at him, feeling as though her entire life had just taken a turn she wasn't ready for. "Sienna, this is an opportunity. Are you ready to take it?" Sienna had never believed in opportunities that fell from the sky. But when she looked into Alexander Carter's eyes, steady, confident, unwavering, she knew he wasn't joking. And that was the most terrifying part. A week later, she stepped into Stella Maris, Alexander's soon-to-open fine dining restaurant in Miami. She wasn't used to flying first class or having staff address her with polished professionalism. It felt like she had walked into a world that didn't belong to her. There wasn't much time to dwell on it, though. From the moment she arrived, the work consumed her. Alexander oversaw everything with meticulous precision. He wasn't just an owner, he was a man who knew every detail of his restaurant, down to the way the lighting fell on the tables or the subtle scent infused into the air. And that meant he was always around. They worked together constantly, discussing menus, debating over dessert plating techniques. At first, their conversations were strictly professional, but gradually, they became something more. Sienna saw glimpses of a different Alexander, not just the cold, calculating businessman the world knew. In the kitchen, away from the prying eyes of investors and executives, he showed her something raw, something real. One late night, long after the staff had gone home, Sienna remained in the kitchen, experimenting with a new recipe. Alexander walked in, his jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up. "Still here?" he asked, leaning against the counter as he watched her knead dough. She smiled. "I'm testing something. Chocolate caramel sea salt tart. Want to try?" He raised an eyebrow, but took a small spoon, scooping a bit of the filling. Silence. Sienna held her breath, waiting. Finally, he nodded. "Perfect." she exhaled. Really? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out, gently brushing away a streak of flour from her cheek. For a moment, time stood still. Their eyes locked, something unspoken yet undeniable passing between them. Then Alexander stepped back, his voice returning to its usual calm. Don't overwork yourself. Get some rest, Sienna. But as he walked out of the kitchen, Sienna knew something between them had already shifted. Alexander Carter had always been a man of control, but just when Sienna thought she was beginning to understand him, he pulled away. It started after a particular evening at the restaurant when a notable guest arrived, Elena Monroe, a powerhouse in the hotel industry and, as Sienna later found out, someone from Alexander's past. She didn't know their full story, but she saw the shift in him instantly, the way his gaze hardened, the way his usual calm became an impenetrable wall. That night, after the restaurant closed, she found him alone on the balcony, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Are you okay?" she asked, stepping closer. Alexander smirked, but there was no humor in his expression. "I'm always okay." Sienna crossed her arms. "Who is Elena?" He was silent for a long moment before exhaling. "She was my fiancée." The words stunned her. Alexander swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "She loved what I represented, not who I was. When I stopped being the perfect choice in her eyes, she left without a second thought." Sienna didn't know what to say. "You know what the worst part is?" Alexander turned to her, his eyes sharp yet filled with something far more vulnerable. "I never really regretted letting her go. What I regret is letting her betrayal make me stop believing in people." Sienna felt the weight of his confession, the rawness beneath his usual controlled exterior. She didn't respond with words. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand over his, where it gripped the glass. Alexander studied her for a long moment before his voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't want to make the same mistake again, Sienna." She wasn't sure if he was talking about Elena or about them, but for the first time, Alexander had let her see the man behind the armor. 3 days after their conversation on the balcony, Sienna noticed Alexander pulling away. He still came to the kitchen, still watched her work, but the quiet moments between them were now filled with hesitation. She knew why. Alexander was afraid of closeness, afraid of trusting someone again, afraid that if he let someone into his world, they would leave, just like Elena had. But Sienna wasn't Elena, and she needed him to understand that. That evening, after a long day at the restaurant, Sienna found Alexander alone on the beach, where the city lights couldn't reach. She stepped closer, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand. "Are you planning to avoid me forever?" Alexander didn't turn immediately, but his voice was quiet when he spoke. "I'm not avoiding you." Sienna smirked. "Really? You've practically disappeared for the last 3 days." He exhaled slowly before finally turning to face her. Under the moonlight, his eyes looked softer, no longer the sharp, calculating gaze of a powerful businessman. "Sienna," he hesitated, as if searching for the right words. She stepped closer, heart pounding. "You're about to tell me that we shouldn't let this go any further, aren't you?" Alexander studied her, then unexpectedly chuckled, a rare, genuine sound. "I think it's already too late for that." Sienna barely had time to process his words before he reached out, his fingers tracing lightly along her cheek. "I told myself not to get too close," he murmured, "but then I kept finding you in everything, in the kitchen, in the way you create, in the way you make everything feel alive." Her breath caught as the space between them disappeared, her pulse thrumming in her ears. "Then stop fighting it," she whispered. Alexander looked at her for a long moment before lowering his head, pressing his lips gently against hers. The kiss wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate, it was an acknowledgement, a silent promise that at last, Alexander was ready to believe again. And beneath the vast, star-filled sky, Sienna knew this wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was the beginning of something real. The next morning, Sienna arrived at the kitchen earlier than usual, but this time, something felt different. Everything had changed after last night, not just because of the kiss beneath the stars, but because Alexander had finally let her in. She was checking the oven when a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "I hope you're not planning to avoid me after last night." Sienna turned, meeting Alexander's rare playful gaze. She smiled. "I don't think I could, even if I wanted to." He stepped closer, no longer hiding what was between them. "Good, because I made dinner reservations for us tonight. Not as employer and employee, just Alexander and Sienna." Her heart pounded faster. This wasn't just a dinner, this was a statement. But before she could respond, a staff member rushed into the kitchen, looking flustered. "Mr. Carter, there's a reporter asking about your relationship with Miss Sienna. They said someone leaked information that you two—" Alexander sighed but didn't seem fazed. Instead, he turned to Sienna, his gaze steady. "Then I guess it's time. The world knows the truth." Sienna reached for his hand, a small smile forming on her lips. And she knew this was only the beginning. When the last employee left and the restaurant doors locked, only Sienna and Alexander remained, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Sienna removed her apron, glancing around. The kitchen was spotless, but the dining area remained empty. She frowned slightly. "You said you made dinner reservations tonight," she recalled. "But where's the table?" Alexander leaned against the bar, a small smirk playing on his lips. "We're setting it up ourselves." Sienna blinked, surprised. "You want to set the table yourself?" He shrugged, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt. "I think it's time to try something different." For the first time, they weren't chef and restaurant owner, weren't employee and powerful businessman. Tonight, they were just two people, creating something meaningful together. They arranged a table in the center of the restaurant, where the twinkling city lights spilled through the large glass windows. Sienna carefully spread a cream-colored tablecloth, smoothing out the wrinkles. Alexander took his time setting up white candles, the soft flames flickering warmly. "You're surprisingly good at this," Sienna teased, watching him adjust the glasses with precision. He shot her a knowing look. "I'm very good at putting things in order, you know that." She laughed, but her heart raced, because this moment felt different. When everything was in place, Alexander poured wine into their glasses before pulling out a chair for her. "Perfect," he murmured, his gaze never leaving hers. They ate, talking about simple things, how many baking disasters Sienna had in culinary school, the first time Alexander tried cooking but forgot to turn on the stove. As dinner neared its end, Sienna started to stand, ready to clear the table, but Alexander reached for her hand. "Wait," he said, something unreadable in his eyes. She watched as he walked into the kitchen. A moment later, he returned with a lemon tart, her favorite dessert. You made this?" Sienna asked, stunned. Alexander looked slightly embarrassed, though he masked it well. "I've been secretly practicing all week, not sure if it's as good as yours, but—" She laughed, her heart melting. Alexander Carter, the man who closed million-dollar deals, had baked for her. But before she could respond, he did something that stole her breath away. He knelt before her, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Sienna, I never thought I'd love again. I told myself I wouldn't, that I couldn't, but then you came into my life. Unexpected, stubborn, impossible to ignore, and somehow you made me believe again. In love, in family, in something real." He opened the box, revealing a stunning diamond ring. "I can't imagine my life without you. Sienna Brooks, will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes, overflowing before she could stop them. She smiled, voice trembling with joy. "Yes, Alexander, 1,000 times yes." As he stood, pulling her into his arms, their lips met and the restaurant faded away, leaving only the sound of their hearts beating in perfect harmony.